Hi, I'm Liz Whitefield, and in case you hadn't noticed, I am not from America. I am from the UK. You'll hear lots of our accents today. Mine is from the north of England, the best part of the United Kingdom, obviously. So hopefully you'll understand me. We're not known for speaking slowly, and we have a lot of jargon and language that we use. And I promise I won't swear either. So thank you ever so much. It's a real privilege to be here today, actually, and to host this amazing panel. So I'm from a company called Hippo. Come and see us if you want to, but we are a digital services consultancy. We build services for UK government, amongst others. But I spent 30 years as a public servant, a senior public servant, so I have lived and breathed a lot of the things we're talking about today, and it's already this morning, I think, seeing that narrative around, joined up services, globally sharing lessons is really exciting. So what's going to happen? I'm going to introduce a panel. We're going to ask, we've got a great panel as well. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get us warmed up, and then we're going to open this up to the audience. So what we'd ask is when you ask a question, if you get the mic, and stand up, let us know so we can see you. State who you are, where you're from, ask your question. Members of the press I know are here today, and that's great that they're here, but they've been asked not to ask questions here because they get lots of time to ask questions afterwards. So thank you all. If that's okay, I'm going to get going and do the introductions. Thank you so much. So this is a great session today. This is the Modern IT for Modern Government session, all about getting federal technology right. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, we've got Larry Bafundo. So Larry is a Deputy Executive Director and Acting Executive Director for Technology Modernisation Fund in the GSA from the USA. And then we have Wes Turbeville, who is sponsoring this event from ID.me. He's Senior Vice President, delivering services across government. And really pleased to have Laura Gerhardt here today as well, who's a Supervisory Policy Analyst and a Director of Technology Modernisation and Data at the Office of Management and Budget and the Executive Office of the President of the United States. And then Scott Jones, the President of Shared Services Canada, has come down to see everybody today. And Darren Ash, the Chief Information Officer for the Department of the Interior of the United States. So a great panel today, and really excited to sort of welcome you here today. So we're going to start off, I think there's a theme here today around how we transform and modernise services for our citizens against a backdrop of quite outdated technology. In the UK, actually, we call that legacy services, which is a bit ironic because it's not a word that's meant with great favour. Those services are not well received. They're not a great gift that's being passed on. They are horrible bits of technology we've got to deal with. So, it shouldn't be used that as a word. But actually, it'd be really great, I think, to get from sort of Scott and then Larry a perspective on how do we sort of transform service against that backdrop of those challenges, Scott?
Well, it's interesting. We call it legacy too, but it sounds better with an accent. I think there's a few things. So shared services mandate is pretty different from what I think most organizations have. So if it requires hosting, we're probably delivering it for all government departments. If it is user-centered technology, we have the responsibility for that. We have to bake cybersecurity in, of course. And then we also provide the connectivity services that connect public servants. We were created about 12 years ago, and it was purely because of the spread of IT and the sprawl that was there. It's not much better, because actually the infrastructure pieces we combine, we know what the plan needs to be, but they're tied to these legacy applications that are critical. And we call them legacy. They have a bad name, except that's how we deliver all our services to citizens. And we tend to put a nice front end on that, but it doesn't matter if it's written in COBOL. Yeah. It's still probably running. Mm-hmm. So we have to change some of the incentives. So first of all, how do you start to change the investment pattern? Because funding's controlled by the political level. You don't fund infrastructure that's not visible to a citizen. So how do we change that model inside of the government where this becomes a continuous cycle, change the incentives and change the rewards? CIOs in government, we have this in and out where there's kind of a hierarchy of government talent that's accepted. I would say IT is almost looked at the bottom. Where policymakers, if you're a policy person, you become an economist, you're probably at the top. Not sure that's right in a service delivery world. Yeah. In fact, I'm sure it's not right. And then you have to start tying IT to programmatic outcomes and incremental rather than big builds. And I think that's actually the biggest failing we have. We do giant modernization projects that are supposed to be planned from the beginning and as if we're building a building. And we're not. It needs to be able to evolve and iterate, and the program structures don't allow that. So those are some of the pieces that we're trying to change.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, I don't know if you recognise that. We should all say that a career in cobalt engineering, we never thought would be still a demand, would it really? It's if you're looking to go into IT. But yeah, I recognise that. Larry, do you see that as well?
Scott and I traded notes because he just described my program, the Technology Modernization Fund at GSA, which provides agencies with flexible funding outside of the normal budgeting process to do a lot of what you described, and also tying funding to incremental milestones. But I'll just go off a little bit in a different direction for the discussion, in the sense that I actually think the conversation around digital transformation doesn't start with technology. One, we should get clear on what we mean by transformation. And the way I think about it is, what we're talking about is thinking about new ways in which people, process, and technology, at a minimum, should interact to deliver on some kind of outcome, right? And there's change management that's part of that. But one thing that we think about a lot at the Technology Modernization Fund is, what do we also mean by the term modernization? And that's also a term I think we need to really be clear on before we understand how to solve it. And what I would propose is, modernization is, quote unquote, a continual process of addressing unmet needs, meaning technology is never finished, and therefore transformation is an iterative, ongoing process. I think a lot of the legacy thinking in our space today, and also probably in the private sector in some areas, is focused on this idea of like whether or not you are modernized. You've moved to a technology, you've moved to the cloud, so now you're a modernized entity. And I think that's exactly the type of thinking that proliferates legacy technology and gets you into that state. And so in order to adopt this continual approach to modernization, I think that agencies in particular need certain foundational technical capabilities, right? Like you do need modern tooling, you do need modern infrastructure, but you also need to adopt new mindsets and approaches and patterns that support that way of thinking. And this is where things like understanding the difference between working incrementally and working iteratively is really important. You'll see a lot of flavors of Agile being sold to federal agencies as a value proposition, and what the government is buying in those cases is a process as opposed to a solution or an approach, right? But if you're not actually responding to feedback along the way, you're just working in stages towards a predefined outcome, that is not in line with this idea of modernization being a continual process, and also doesn't help agencies learn and shape solutions based on evidence.
Yeah, very powerful, I think. And actually, a good point to move to you, Darren, if that's all right, and sort of talk about really how you join up across government in terms of, how do you make that join up of technology work across departments, and really how do we encourage government to cooperate around some of those areas?
Yeah, thank you. And with respect to just government agency or department collaboration, yes, that goes on. Obviously, we think about it, and it's wonderful to see how it occurs at the global level, particularly with our partners at GSA, DHS, others. But I think just even locally for the Department of Interior, I think about our deep and longstanding collaboration with the Department of Agriculture. Mm-hmm. But again, it gets back to not the who we're working with, but really what we're trying to solve. Yeah. Together, we work really all the way up to the secretary level on wildland fire. I know that was a big topic we were talking about right before, about just the massive wildfires and just the shared interest and obviously goals of the two departments to be able to meet the challenge. And really for us within the IT community, that also means what is it we do? Again, resources are limited. We know, that's just the environment we work in. We need to be efficient, we need to be effective, and it really forces us and encourages us to work closely together around the shared infrastructure, around the tools, around the capabilities. We don't want to invest multiple times for the same purpose. Yeah. Trying to to meet the same challenge, and really that objective of, again, that efficiency, that effectiveness, and really working together is the best way for us to again, meet that mission.
Yeah, and I think there's a definite need then to convince people who are often holding control of procurement policy making to how do we convince them that actually it needs a different approach, a collaborative approach. I mean, and Laura, have you got a view on how do we, what's needed to sort of influence policymakers? How do we convince them that you can't just buy a thing? You talked about buying a service, but, you know, and put large investment in. You need to continually invest whilst delivering it for value. How do we convince those policymakers and budget holders?
And I think building on what others have said in terms of that incremental delivery, I think part of it is also framing what you're delivering in terms of that programmatic and that mission value. When you can demonstrate, especially with concrete measures, reduced burden, you know, increased efficiency, higher value to the program leaders, that helps them have that stakeholder input and that buy-in. And separately, in developing some of these shared services and that collaboration, having the mission-driven partners right there in the development, not, you know, throwing it over the wall, making sure that their input is part of it and that end user input is part of it. You build those constituencies and you build that stakeholder buy-in. And in particular, as framing that in those investments, sort of truly quantifying that value in those mission-driven outcomes, that really is where I've seen IT leaders and technology leaders break outside of sort of their own silo, right? You know, especially I'm a technologist, loving sort of, you know, the faster delivery and the accelerating, but it's really not an end to itself, right? And so kind of getting on the mindset as an end to itself. And you've heard that a lot here today around how it's impacting sort of the service delivery for the public. And also, I think, especially from our vantage point, how is it impacting that employee experience within the federal agencies or within sort of the state and local and tribal entities that a lot of our services are supporting? And so it's like that the communication internally also sort of helping them see this is what we've accomplished, here's where we're not yet there, and here's what you can get. What you, the mission leader, can get from that is really sort of where we can drive and build that sort of collaborative buy-in to build and change that stakeholder management around modernization not being complete and recognizing that the capabilities that we're inputting today is how we know how to solve it today. But things are going to come along that are sort of going to change those paradigms, and we might want to reevaluate that. So if we fundamentally understand what we're trying to accomplish from that mission perspective, we'll be able to sort of pivot agilely and incrementally as new technologies develop to support that and get those funded and get that alignment of those resources to get there.
So really interesting there, talking about kind of the service users are also the staff that are experiencing that technology and often get thought about at the end. I think something that definitely the UK government's got right in lots of areas and still challenges, I think, as well. But you also talked there about like telling the stories, demonstrate this is why it adds value, which I think is really interesting. I mean, whereas you're seeing things from across different sectors, different organisations, what's your take on kind of like joining up services and things like that? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of, like our mental model is to start with the user in mind and who the audience is. And I think if you were to ask sort of everybody here, like who is your user, it's a slightly different answer. But when you think about linking to the mission outcomes, it's who is going to benefit from the mission outcomes. So if you're selling infrastructure services to other agencies or you're making benefit services to a targeted group of users, you just have to start with the user in mind. And then I think the second thing, just to build on what you said, Laura, is how do you link the investment you want to make to the mission outcomes that you're trying to drive? And one of our observations, just working across lots of government agencies, is that they're not linked quite as broadly enough. And so one IT investment in something like digital identity, can reduce fraud. It can also reduce demand into call centers. And so how, if you have less demand for account and identity management coming into your call center, can that be repurposed into clearing backlogs, handling more cases, reducing time to serve, et cetera? And so making that case across all of the ways that an IT investment can touch the mission and backing up with data and personal stories is, I think, how the strongest case can be made. Yeah.
Apologies, I touched my mic because he mentioned users. And it gets me at an emotional level, which is really sad. I'm sorry. I apologise for that. I've admitted something to a large audience I shouldn't there, that I love user-centred design. Jen earlier on this morning talked about, I was fascinated, a brilliant sort of opening talk from Jen and Claire, but she talked about using the power of procurement. Actually, I've never heard anybody say that about procurement to ensure security by design, and it's quite inspiring actually. You do have to put those controls in, and I think in the services we're building and using procurement, but equally, procurement can sometimes stifle innovation and not move quickly enough for departments. So Scott, and then perhaps Darren's perspective on, I mean, Scott, in terms of, how do we help procurement, how do we get them to embrace that, a different way of working? Or maybe you've already achieved that.
Well, we have definitely not achieved that. But part of shared services is actually we do a lot of the IT procurement for the Government of Canada. I think there's a couple of pieces. Number one is how do you can't, we tend to look to procurement as if you're buying a thing, and it's the entire procurement system's been designed to buy something.
Yeah.
So a pen, even a building, a ship, not that we're necessarily great at those, but the pens we're pretty good at. But that's not what IT is, and that thing changes and evolves over time. And so you're almost trying to say, how do I procure more of a relationship side of things? So what does that need to be? What are the critical outcome, the critical kind of the critical success measures that we need to have in place, and how do we build that? How do we do it more incremental? Right now, a lot of government procurement is incredibly expensive to bid on, which means it drives out almost all of the small and medium enterprises, where you're probably seeing a little bit of more of the innovation coming forward. On the other hand, you're probably going to get a more stable product, one that isn't likely to get bought up, and in this world of a lot of IT is consolidating it at this point, particularly around the cybersecurity side. The old adage that used to be no CIO got fired for buying IBM way in the past. Yeah. Going with a big provider gives you a bit of stability. On the other hand, what capabilities are you missing? And can you have a strategy? Government likes to buy one big thing. I'm not sure. Well, that's not our strategy. Our strategy is that we want a minimum of 2+1. Yeah. 2 in the field and 1 in a lab or in a small deployment somewhere to balance it out. But you've got to try and do some of those strategies, more agile procurement. We're trying to do some no-bid procurements for smaller items. Yeah. But it's a challenge to get right, because in government, if it goes wrong, you're in front of elected officials explaining why you took this risk and how did you not foresee it. And if you don't take the risk, why is your project so expensive when somebody in the private sector could deliver it for X dollars? Yeah. We've got to figure out how to change that conversation.
Yeah, and I don't know what you recognize.
So from my vantage point, and it's a sad observation, there's plenty of folks that see procurement as the impediment, as the barrier. No, they're not. I mean, the way we all need to think about our procurement partners, I'm going to use that word, partners, they're to help. So think about what we're all trying to achieve. And so it gets even into the concepts of project mindsets versus product mindsets. There are ways, and for those that are within the U.S. federal government, there's a heck of a lot of things that the FAR allows you to do.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah.
Again, there's things you want to stay away from a legal perspective, but this is where the procurement community can help guide and help shape an acquisition, an approach that makes sense, that really helps you achieve those goals and deliver the services you need in a very strategic, very thoughtful, and frankly, agile way. Yeah. And so again, it gets back to how the mindset you take into this. Are they there to work with you, or are they an impediment? The right mindset is they're our partner and a strategic partner at that.
Yeah, that collaboration as a theme across everything, I think. Okay, I think what we'd like to do is get you all involved. So hopefully you've got some great questions to challenge and excite our panel. Anybody got any questions? Want to stand up for us for the mic, please? Oh, gentleman over there. Apologies for torturing me with the light, so if I can't
Thank
see
you. Is this, oh, there we go.
Yeah.
A little too loud for me now. So my name's John Roberts. I'm a Presidential Innovation Fellow working on WIC modernization at USDA. So this was selfishly really helpful. Thank you for helping me think through a few things on my mind this week. As you might know, so our supplemental program for women, supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children is administered at the state and local level, and those systems are procured, maintained by those state and local authorities. From your perspective, when we talk about modernization, if you're an agency at a local level that is resource constrained, that struggles to kind of keep the lights on, what advice do you have for that type of agency at that level to think about modernization and break out of the cycle of just putting Band-Aids on and getting past operating and maintaining the legacy?
So I'm going to ask Larry to take that one. Thank you. Thank you for the question. And then Laura.
Yeah, so in my last job, I was at the Department of Labor. I was working on then a $2 billion effort to modernize the nation's unemployment insurance systems, which is structured in a very similar way. It's a federal-state partnership where the federal government sets the rules and provides oversight, but the states administer the program, a lot like WIC and others like SNAP and things like that. I would say fundamentally it's a very, very big challenge. I do not think that there is an answer that does not include the federal government being a strong partner in those relationships and dynamics. And what we saw traction on in that complex environment is a lot of these state agencies are actually looking for an understanding of what does good look like. They're not necessarily looking for standards and being held against them, but they're looking for guidance around what does good look like. And that's a really, I think, important role for the federal government to play as a trusted broker and help, especially when it has an oversight responsibility, to help sort of set a path, at least, for these agencies to understand how to move from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2 in practical terms, not just in terms of high-level outcomes. I think that's step one, but what you're asking about is a really, really complicated challenge that ultimately requires long-term funding and good program design.
Laura, any?
Yeah, and I came from the General Services Administration from 18F, and that's an embedded digital startup. And we'd often work with a lot of implementing partners at federal agencies, and we had the ability to work with state and local when they were federally funded, sort of in a similar way to the SNAP program. And one of the things that sort of is an impetus oftentimes when we start to, both in our own teams and the agency partners we were working with, was an impetus to want to centralize, right? That like, hey, you're doing this repeatedly, why don't we just build it for you? And one of the sort of healthy tensions we found, and I think this gets to what Larry was saying, was the wanting something to look to, but also the trust in building that, right? That if you're building it for them, they may have sort of concerns around what does this mean for my own accountability? How might I lose some of my sort of individual autonomy? You know, we're a pretty diverse and decentralized nation. What might work in the Northeast might not work in a rural community in the Southwest. And making sure in that, you know, that you're again sort of building in that user-centeredness and that human-centered design with those partners, and also kind of approaching some of the oversight with inquiry. Some of the projects where they really helped the sort of federal partners dig into where are you struggling, where are you meeting those needs, where they were able to have a lot more effective, supportive, and mission-driven conversations with that, rather than just saying, okay, we could just build this for this, here, use it, right? That how has that ever worked? And it always sort of falls flat and kind of erodes some of that trust, rather than the building with and building for with those end users.
I think Laura brings up a very good point about understanding essentially where these agencies are in their journey. So we support 27 state agencies on unemployment insurance claims, and everybody's at a different place. And so there's a responsibility for us as a technology provider to be able to have flexible solutions that can essentially meet the agencies where they are, right? And we have to be able to sort of move up and down the ladder, because there's the fixed point where they are when we start, but they're also on a journey to move. And so how do you grow with the agencies? And so the way we typically do that is through having a couple of different stages or phases of an integration that can meet agencies where they are.
That's really interesting, and that sort of maturity and capability. So we talk about digital maturity, and it's about the ability to sort of adapt and understand those problems and overcome some of the barriers you talked about. It's fascinating. Right, another question. There's a lady here.
I'm really excited that you're talking about legacy modernization and cloud. I've been in this space for a very long time. My name is Rama Murthy. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Hatha Systems. You don't know us yet. One of the things that I've seen in the legacy modernization effort is that, and it's not a criticism, it has a little bite. I apologize in advance for the bite. So these contracts are issued out. They're issued out to a large-scale integrator, because they're massive modernization efforts usually. It may be a legacy system that's 6 million lines of code, whatever the issue is. And you're worried about the safety of making sure you get to the finish line. But there's always an issue of cost overruns, schedule delays, and all these things you've seen time and time and again. Yeah? The fundamental thing we've seen over and over again is that there's this assumption that the integrator who's been there before or has not been there takes on the responsibility of understanding what's in the current system to understand how to plan and execute on that modernization to get to the end result. Now, what's interesting is that the government doesn't take the responsibility for making sure that transparency is under their control and that they actually have a programmatic oversight to ensure that they set the definition of what the requirements are, which they do, but to understand the transparency to see how far away they are from that requirement as a gap, set the RFP correctly so that you get a more accurate bid with more transparency to the integrator, and then as the integrator is working it out and get to the finish line, they're not actually going through and re-evaluating it to ensure that it's exactly what you need from a mission standpoint. There are tools out there in the world that actually enable you to have that happen.
So what's the question?
Sorry.
No, absolutely, it is absolutely fascinating, and we're getting a lot of nods here from the panel. But
So
what's the question you want to ask?
The question is, how far away is government from actually putting together a program that actually takes more control of that oversight and separate out the fox from the hen house in the integrator?
Fantastic. I think we're there. Right, Scott, do you want to come in on that? Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. You've hit on the right thing. I think, first of all, there's a fundamental error in that we assume it's a one-for-one replacement. Because what we need to do is we need to look at the fact that when we built these things, it was probably built in the era of where the mainframe was the dominant architecture model. And we don't spend the time to deconstruct and decouple the tightly coupled system that was built in a world where that was the norm. That was the design kind of paradigm we all worked with. So starting to do the decoupling work, I think, first of all, get you out of that, try and figure out how this giant ball of confusion that is our existing system starts to work. That's hard work. But that's something that you also don't need a ton of funding for. The IT people that are there probably know it. In some cases, they're probably on contract after they've long retired to try and keep it working, but they understand this. So start to just slowly make it better, a little bit at a time, so that you can get that velocity going, I think, is number one. Second one is, you're absolutely right, you can't outsource your reputation. And whether you bring in a system integrator or not, it doesn't matter. It's still, for us, a Government of Canada project. So, but how do you bring them in as the partner where they've got a skill set or a challenge function that maybe you don't have internally? But I think we need to completely change the paradigm of modernization and stop talking about modernizing the system and looking, what do we need to build for the platform? And then we start to deconstruct the legacy systems. Unfortunately, I think we're all facing the same challenge. Underneath all of that, underneath this application level, which I've been talking about, is rotting infrastructure.
Yeah.
So I've got data centers that the generator is, I can't afford to replace it because my investment goes to my enterprise, world-class, brand new data centers. I don't have the money to life cycle the hardware. I don't have the life cycle for the PDUs, et cetera. And so we tend to let that drive our modernization. Doesn't get you the citizen outcomes I think we need. So we've got to change the paradigm, but that's a very different conversation, requiring a lot different IT skills.
Any observations on that, Darren?
I think, Scott, you bring up a very important point about, because these are so all-encompassing across the application layers, et cetera, and down in the infrastructure, this is why it's actually really important to have a broad collaboration across SIs, the technology providers, government, U.S. Digital Service, all have a seat at the table, so you actually have a better understanding of where your trade space are, right? You can work backwards from what your ideal is, but say, well, if we can't get there, if I make this little investment over on infrastructure and this much in applications, like, what is the trade-offs that I can get to the solution that's closest to where I want to hit the mark? And I think that requires kind of a large ecosystem collaboration.
The only thing I was going to bring up, and probably another hour session on it itself, is our workforce. And I think you may have touched on it, which is loss of institutional knowledge. We have an absolute need and interest to be able to sustain that institutional knowledge among our workforce to be able to manage those types of programs. Yeah. So again, whole other session I'm sure we could talk about.
We talked about there are certain engineering jobs that are probably worth more because of the fact that people just don't have those skills anymore. You're absolutely right.
Can I ask something really quick?
Of course you can.
So nothing to add on the point. I appreciated the comment too. I also want to take the opportunity to highlight that, let's also recognize the people, heroes really, who are maintaining these systems, have to come up with workarounds to just make the technology support the mission because of those constraints. I saw a really great presentation recently that was talking about the modernization of a state benefit program that was dealing with legacy software and framing it in the context of an archaeological study where there are layers and layers of civilizations living on top of each other, and you have to go dig really deep to understand how everything works to take it apart. But my point is, like, it's a really great point, and a lot of the comments here I think are right. But like, let's also recognize like the amount of work that goes into just keeping these things operational and functional.
Yeah, how many people still know COBOL?
Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's a brilliant comment, actually, and I want the link to that video. It sounds great as well. Thank you. Okay, I think there's a lady behind the other lady that wanted to ask a question last time. Is there somebody over there? If not, we'll go to other questions. Sorry, I was just trying to... Oh, lady over here, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane from the Department of State, and I like what the gentleman said about partnership with procurement. So my question to you is, how do we get procurement and even our IT bureau to be able to say yes without having us to get things FedRAMP or ATO when we're trying to like launch like software applications? Because a lot of times our procurement office is like, go talk to your IT bureau. I don't know whether I can buy this for you. And then our IT bureaus will say, I don't know if I can buy this. I don't know this system that well. I don't know this application. So how do you bridge that? How do you make that happen?
So I think I talked about partnership. I'll throw in the word collaboration too. There are ways properly to get these types of things done within the constraints and guidance from our friends from OMB, from the FAR, from law, that are all possible. But I think the old adage of it's not, don't ask them, can I do it?
Yeah.
Talk to me about how we can do it. And it's a different frame of reference and a different set of questions, and let them, it's coming to the table, and let them also help solve the problem. Frame it, and really ask it a different way, and I think that's a better path to tackling some of the things that you raised.
Yeah. And Laura, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I feel like I have to speak a little bit on FedRAMP because that's one of my main policy focus areas over at OMB. So if you're not familiar, if you're one of our international partners, FedRAMP is our secure cloud authorization. It's run out of the General Services Administration, and it really takes the paradigm that if one of our federal agencies or a group of them can leverage a cloud security authorization, let's not have them do rework. Let's reuse that. And what that is, it's been around since 2011, and it's really allowed the sort of initial utilization of cloud within federal government. But we're really kind of operating off of a 10-year-old paradigm. And we're really right now, last fall in October, we released draft guidance, and we're reviewing over 160 comments on FedRAMP and really looking in particular, how do we make sure we scale the marketplace? Because right now there's only around 300 different products or service offerings. And I think both industry and agency knows there's so much more we want to use, and there's so much more we should be using. And so we're really looking at ways that we can create new authorization paths so we're not compromising security. If anything, we're trying to hone in the processes so they're laser focused on good security outcomes. That'll build confidence within agencies to leverage the reuse, making sure we're having conversations about prioritization. For instance, with the AI executive order, we're looking at how we might prioritize some generative AI capabilities. And also we're looking at process automation. I know even like last week, GSA had a whole week session of looking from a process perspective, where are there points in the journey maps of both agencies and industry providers that we can streamline that? So FedRAMP isn't the barrier, it's like the stamp of approval of, I feel good about being able to use this product in government.
That's brilliant, and actually there's a whole, it's often not what we're trying to achieve, it's how we achieve it, and creating that understanding of the complexities of navigating to get what you want, and that is absolutely something, I'm doing it again, stop doing that, Liz. You recognise from UK government that understanding the how, there's always a way, but you've got to be able to find that route. Okay, another question. Got on there? Thank you, sorry. It's in my blind spot. Hi. You okay?
Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes.
perfect.
Can.
Here we go. Hi, my name is Jordan Dominguez. I work as a product manager for Citizenship and Immigration Services. And my work happens, several layers below the CIO level, and I'm curious sort of how you approach wanting to both sort of set things from the top down, the mission-driven, outcome-oriented aspect of it, with kind of enabling the people on the ground floor to pivot as they see things, or to kind of share that knowledge upwards.
Ooh, great to hear from, I think, nearly all the panel here on this, but
Sure,
start with
that's a
Darren and
wonderful
come round.
question, and I think a lot of it starts with our responsibility to establish the vision, set the strategies, and most importantly, communicate what those are. But it's a two-way street, because it's one thing to be able to say, here's what we want, here's our goals, here's what we want, here's the direction, here's our North Star, here are our priorities. But it's also absolutely important for us in the CIO suite and our colleagues to listen. It really has to be that two-way dialogue to understand, not just to say, here's what we're doing, but to get that candid feedback. Get those new ideas. Are there things that we're missing? We're not all knowing. I mean, again, we're not all knowing, and I think we benefit collectively as an organization when we have that type of dialogue, that listening, and to understand, really, are there things we need to pivot to? Is there something we need to adjust? Doesn't always have to be fixed. And I think that is, in my mind, a really good way to approach that. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, and Darren, Scott, any perspective on that after Darren's comment?
Yeah, I think absolutely couldn't agree more on vision and setting the parameters, but also not setting such a rigid structure from the beginning at the top. I would absolutely agree. I think though there is a place where when you need to pivot, is it differentiating because we need to do it to deliver the mission and to deliver the capability, or differentiating because I like this better? So one of my first kind of executive jobs was running an application development job. And every team picked their own set of tooling, their own set of testing suites, their own set of databases, everything like that. And I inherited a group that was underfunded from the beginning, but it was 80% of the resources in this development shop were purely supporting underlying technologies that were being used. And little by little, and this actually goes to a question earlier, we would fix one thing at a time and try and reduce that. So you go from 6 testing suites down to 5, then to 4, then to 3. And maybe you're not going to get to 1 because it doesn't cover all the things. 3 years later, we're 80% new development, 20%. So why are you differentiating, and what do you need to pivot to? But it can't be so rigid that you don't pivot ever again because you've set the standard. So we did go down to, for example, application servers. So you can tell how many years ago I was running this team, about 20 years ago. We went down to 1, and then by the time I left, we were back up to 2 because this one wasn't innovating in the path that we wanted to. So this was going to become all our new applications. So I would say understanding the motivation for it and why, what the pivot's required for is important. Because a lot of time we just say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Problem is somebody has to clean up the flower bed.
Larry, any?
So I think that's a great question. I agree a lot with what the panel said. I think ultimately it's a culture question. I'm trying to see you in the audience. Ultimately, I think it's a culture question, what you're talking about, because you don't become a product-driven organization just by reading a book or going to a class or saying that we're going to be focused on outcomes, or even just articulating the mission, vision, and the objectives and key results, whatever you use to keep people aligned. So what I would suggest for folks like you is to, one, always be a doer, but 2, how can you help bring more of a testing mindset to the leaders in your organization? If they have a strong assumption, how might we test that? How can you show tangible results that help inform learning and confidence in new directions? Often I think that just putting things in people's hands, particularly leaders who are not comfortable with new ways of working, is the most effective wedge for change.
Yeah. Maybe if I could build on that, I think one other piece of that is also closing the feedback loop. And I'll tell a very short story in Social Security. I hope you don't mind if I use you briefly for a moment. But earlier this year, Social Security deployed federal benefits units access on State Department websites. So American citizens living overseas could access their Social Security benefits. And they used some of the international verification capabilities with IDME to be able to enable that. And we were actually at a national tax forum where we were supporting the IRS, and had somebody who was living overseas who had flown into the US for this forum come running over to our table and essentially say, can you please tell Social Security thank you for what they did, because I'm able to access my benefits for the first time from overseas in over 20 years. And so, we're happy to close that feedback loop with the folks at Social Security, and then it's up to them to trickle down to make sure that you see how the work that you're doing is connected to the mission and the delivery of it.
That's really important. Anything to add to that, Laura?
I have a lot of different thoughts. I think one of the key things around it is often the product delivery teams have a completely different language than IT executive leadership. And one of my previous roles on 18F was bringing in a lot of private industry engineering talent, both as a hiring manager and a supervisor. And a lot of the conversations I would have with them, they're like, well, why can't we just do this? This is clearly the right technical choice. Was making sure that they were communicating that in the jargon, candidly, of like federal IT leadership. And almost the way that sort of unlocked it most frequently was risk. Because it's something that is very cognizant. Again, you don't get, the leaders are gonna be brought up. And so helping them understand how the counterfactual of not doing something, it articulated are an X business risks, S cybersecurity risks, Y, schedule risks, right? That those are things that are often something that they're trying to monitor. And like you're saying, Darren, a good leader is gonna listen and say, how can I bring the resource? And also when you introduce, here's a risk, and if they say, okay, well, what do you need to do that? Having a teed up answer, they may not be able to say, okay, I'm gonna get you that tomorrow, but especially good leadership will listen and say, okay, well, I can't offer you this, but here's something akin, will that work for you? And so I think bridging, I almost think it's like oftentimes a real challenge with sort of the dueling cultures, but I think a lot of that does actually come to sort of different languages being spoken within sort of IT and digital service delivery.
I think that translation role is so important. I think just to sort of that communication down as well, I think is really, really critical, isn't it? And it's a great analogy for good leaders. I think we could probably have a debate about not good leaders and bad leaders, but that's another session entirely and probably a whole conference. I've got a gentleman over here, and I'm conscious, and we'll come to this side. Sorry, apologies, am I? So I think there's a gentleman over here with his hand up. Where's the mics gone? I'm losing the... Where are the mics gone? It's all right. Oh, it's coming. Here you go. It might be that there was somebody else about to ask a question, so apologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll come over here.
Am I on? Okay, good. I'm Chris Elder from GSA. One of the things that I have as a national account manager is through the acquisition phase, or acquisition lifecycle, effective communication that has to go through the team, right? How do you address that to ensure that you're hitting those timelines and also hitting those obligation timeframes within, the fiscal year?
Who wants to take that one?
Maybe I'll start. I think the first thing is the acquisition life cycle for us, the procurement life cycle. You have to start with knowing what model you want. So lowest cost compliant for commodity goods makes a lot of sense. The problem is that's our favorite model because it's the one that's the easiest to understand. But understanding best value and having those discussions and allowing a feedback phase at the beginning is, I think, actually really important, because you start the dialogue from the start to say, is what I'm asking for, does it even make sense in the market and where the market's going? So we tend to do a lot of consultation phases or before the procurement actually goes out as an RFP to respond to. So you get feedback back. The second one is reflecting that back a couple times to industry, because you'll also get the lobby side, trying to come in and getting the RFP shaped so that it gives a benefit to a certain vendor, and good on them if it works. Like, they want the business, and it's good to want the business. We've got to be careful to make sure that we're not driving ourselves down there. But so you go back and forth. So I think you started off with a dialogue rather than a 1,800 requirements, respond in and say, I'll be compliant to it all, and then you start a fight with change orders. Starting that discussion at the very beginning as the contract's being issued to say, what are the key success factors? And understanding that the words matter, and the words aren't going to be interpreted the same on the government side as they are on the vendor side. And so really understanding that, and maybe you start with prototypes, et cetera. So we're trying to design more stages in, It's a learning process, though. And then you also have good vendors and you have bad vendors. You have people who are absolutely dedicated to the partnership because for them, government's a good customer to be able to point to other people, say, I work with them. And then there are vendors who are looking because they can see you as a cash cow. And then you treat them differently. Those strategic vendors who are partners, you talk to them, you bring them in, you go through this, where's your product going? Because I'm heading this way. And so I think you've really got to try and figure out how to establish that dialogue and let the procurement process be designed to get the right outcome.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do.
And I think we'll get an industry view as well, actually. And from my perspective, I've sat on both sides of that. I've been looking to get suppliers, and I've sat on the other side. And the engagement process through the RFP is so important. That industry engagement before these procurements come out is so critical, I think, to understanding the problem that government is trying to solve. Do you recognise that as well, Wes?
Yeah, and I think for us, we always try to essentially match the vision and the delivery of the mission outcomes, right? And I think it's one of those things where getting into that cadence where we have to tell you where we're going, and as a shared service, what we're hearing from other agencies to see how some of those problems align, and then through that, see if it lines up with where you need to take your solutions and your investments, and try to get to that vision match.
Okay. We have the gentleman here at the front, I think, had his hand up. Can get my mic. This might be one of the last questions, so if you have been trying to get a question in, just put your hand and desperate to get a question in, and then I'll hand over to this gentleman. Okay, I'm going to come over there. Right, if you'd like to.
Thank you. Eric Powers, Chief Business Officer at Social Security. When we talk about shared technology in government, we often talk about infrastructure. At the agency level, we're delivering services, and those services are often created from capabilities. When you look across services in government, you have a lot of shared capabilities that we often build over and over again. So the infrastructure is helpful, but we're still spending a lot on creating capability. Things like how many high-impact service providers need to do things like schedule appointments with their beneficiaries or customers, or have secure communications with those customers that respect customer preferences. So my question is, how do we shift to capability, talking about capabilities, and then also the discoverability of those capabilities across government?
I mean, Darren,
Yeah, I'll start. I think a lot of it comes back to awareness. And let's just stay within a particular organization, department, or agency about what's out there, let alone conversations going on between departments. But I think about if I go into the no-code, low-code space, some of that should be done through the sharing of code, especially to avoid having to redo it and to recreate it. So I think there are opportunities and organizations and agencies that are doing that. But I think a lot of it just gets back to just creating those, again, the dialogue, the awareness, and knowing that that is possible.
Anybody want to add to that? Any thought? I mean, obviously, Scott, you're looking after shared services. You recognise that?
Well, all too well. I think there's a couple things. So first of all, during the pandemic, we did like every other government. We shifted massively online for just how we worked as a department. And then we very rapidly took a tool that was designed for collaboration, and we managed to recreate departmental or ministerial silos by putting barriers in place, not trusting tenancies, making it hard to find each other. So I think reducing some of those barriers within the public service can at least facilitate the conversations that need to happen for sharing of some of those capabilities. Like, how do you even find the other teams that could be doing something similar outside of your department or agency? It's hard in the government of Canada. I can't imagine what it's like in the U.S. government. Well, actually, I can. It's like, I was seconded down here for a year. It's hard. So I think you reduce some of those barriers. You start to see what the tooling can bring. You start to create at least a natural path for people to have those discussions. My colleagues are here from the Canadian Digital Service and our Office of our Chief Information Officer of Canada. And then we try to create some cross-government platforms for people to collaborate on. Now, I would say they're not as successful as we would like. But how do you create that sense of community as well, where people start to naturally share? But that's what we're concentrating on right now. How do you reduce those barriers? How do you make it easy for public servants to collaborate with each other, or people working with the public service on the public service network? At least that would reduce some of those barriers. Then there's the bigger piece, right? The federal budget was just announced Tuesday, which is why I wasn't in some of the sessions yesterday. For the first time, we finally got Sign in Canada funding. So login.gov equivalent for us. Because otherwise, it's a piece of infrastructure that, and that's part of but that's a good first step. And that will promote, once citizens see that, are they really going to accept the fact that it's different here to collaborate? I don't know. I think citizens demand a better level of service.
I mean, that's an amazing achievement as well, to achieve that milestone in terms of funding. Laura, I mean, this will probably be Laura closing us out as well, so this will just to...
I would say that how many times have you also been with a team where you say, well, there's this shared service or broaderly used service, and they're like, well, no, it doesn't do what I want to do. And so I'm going to go off and make my own because I can't see how this could possibly fit in it. And I think, and I'm sure Wes has the experience, like, sometimes that alignment is legitimate, right? And so how do we build in more modular services to sort of support more than just sort of this broad ecosystem, but really sort of component-based that can sort of slot in where you need? And foundationally, that kind of gets to making sure that shared service is actually meeting the end user need. There probably are a lot of scheduling tools throughout of government. And some of them are going to be consolidated, could be consolidated, but some of them, are not the right choice because it'd be a really degraded experience for the people trying to use that. And so if you don't sort of build in that human-centered design and the end user experience, people are always going to say, I'd rather not use that. And again, similarly, the integration experience needs to be great too. And so that you can plug it in easily, and especially the developer teams understand what's capability, how they can bring it in, and also if they need to, rip it out, right? Because what we have today, again, is not the end game of modernization. It's what we have today. So you need to be able to bring those in and pull them out when something makes more sense on that.
Okay, I mean, we're going to have to, that is a great point to end on, actually. But our time is up. That has gone so quickly from my perspective, and I hope you've all got a lot out of the session, as you have with the rest of the sessions today. I'd really like to thank all our panel members for doing such a great job and for putting up with my northern UK accent, which is an achievement for you today. And I hope to see you all soon. But thank you ever so much. We can give a round of applause to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.